Opening the center immediately, it stakes a claim for early piece activity and potential kingside advances. Black immediately stakes a claim in the center, creating immediate counterplay and refusing to cede central dominance. Opening up the diagonal for the queen, this knight centralizes, preparing a rapid development of kingside pieces. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop and challenging central space immediately. Gaining central space with f4 risks weakening your king's protection. Be prepared for a sharp tactical battle. Embracing the fianchetto, black seeks to pressure the center from the flank. Developing the knight to a natural square bolsters control over the center and prepares for kingside castling, a sound positional step. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal immediately prepares for pawn advances and offers a safe haven for the king as the center begins to heat up. Developing the bishop to the active diagonal contests the dark squares and prepares for kingside castling with intent. Solidifying the center, this prepares to challenge the f4 pawn and develop the queen's bishop. Securing the king amidst the evolving pawn structure instantly fortifies the monarch, preparing for potential future exchanges and creating a safe haven as the center becomes a more active battleground. A solidifying maneuver, the knight tucks back to a more protected square, reinforcing the e5 advance and preparing to potentially contest the d7-g7 diagonal if the bishop were to move, while also offering flexibility for future pawn advances or defensive formations. Establishing central pawn presence while preparing for potential pawn breaks like e5 or c4. This maneuver solidifies the kingside and clears the path for the queen to potentially support an advance. Developing the knight to its most natural square, this move efficiently bolsters the center and prepares for kingside castling, a crucial step in safeguarding the monarch amidst white's aggressive pawn advance. It also subtly prepares to contest the d4 square should white decide to push their central pawn. Securing the queenside flank opens up possibilities for queenside expansion, potentially preparing b4 to gain space and restrict black's development, while simultaneously discouraging any ideas of b4 ideas from black. Safeguarding the monarch with castling solidifies the king's position, a prudent step before venturing into more aggressive play. This fundamental maneuver harmonizes the king with the rooks, preparing for potential central actions and defensive consolidation, while the pawn structure on the kingside remains relatively uncompromised for now. Shifting the bishop to this square prepares for a potential kingside attack by clearing the way for the g-pawn's advance, while also offering a subtle defensive retreat should black's central pressure intensify. Shifting the rook to b8 aims to liberate the queenside and prepare for an active rook lift, potentially targeting the c-file or supporting a pawn push. This maneuver skillfully seeks to activate a previously passive piece and contest central influence from a different angle. Preparing to unleash the kingside pawn storm, the queen retreats to a central, unmolested square, anticipating a potential advance of the f-pawn. Initiating a bold knight sortie towards the center, this placement aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the now less defended kingside. Observe how this centralized knight now eyes squares like c2 and e2, hinting at future skirmishes. Disrupting black's central pawn structure with this exchange opens up the d-file for potential piece activity, aiming to exploit the now undefended d6 pawn and create threats against the king's flank. Accepting the pawn on d4 initiates a strategic exchange that significantly alters the pawn structure, potentially opening lines for both sides and demanding careful calculation regarding piece activity and central influence. Clearing a path for the queen's regrouping, the knight embarks on a journey to c3, aiming to bolster the center and potentially support a kingside initiative, while simultaneously relinquishing the f3 square, a subtle shift in the dynamic interplay of pieces. Developing the bishop to d7 is a sensible step for black, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside, while also providing a safe retreat square for the king if the f-file ever becomes truly problematic. Bolstering the bishop's diagonal to potentially pressure black's queenside pawns, while also preparing for a kingside pawn storm, a subtle repositioning to enhance piece harmony before unleashing central or flank attacks. Asserting control over the open c-file now becomes the primary objective, creating pressure that might force concessions from white's slightly passive piece placement. Shifting the bishop to b3 subtly reinforces the pawn on d4, while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside advance by indirectly supporting the knight on e2. This qb6 maneuver aims to exploit the slight awkwardness of white's bishop on b3, potentially creating attacking chances on the queen side by creating threats against c3 or indirectly pressuring the center. The queen now eyes the queenside pawn structure and offers a path for the rook to become active on the b-file, aiming to seize it or launch a pawn storm if white's defenses crumble. Securing the king from potential diagonal threats and freeing the g-file for future rook maneuvers are the primary aims behind this seemingly passive king retreat, preparing the board for a more dynamic middle game engagement by prioritizing king safety above all else. Seeking to unblock the bishop on g7 and activate the queen, black maneuvers the rook to the open e-file, creating potential threats against white's central pawn structure. Opening up the queenside flank provides potential for queenside counterplay and a more active rook presence. Black finally breaks open the center, challenging white's pawn structure and liberating the bishop on g7, aiming to activate the queenside pieces and potentially exploit the d4 square. Initiating a flank attack, white aims to pry open the queenside and disrupt black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses around the queen and indirectly pressuring the central d4 pawn. Shattering the apparent symmetry, this gambit by black aims to inject immediate dynamism into the queenside, challenging white's recently acquired space and potentially opening lines for counterplay against the king. Unleashing a potent queenside initiative, bb4 immediately contests black's influential queen and its control over the queenside diagonal, simultaneously preparing to disrupt white's pawn structure if black chooses to capture. Black repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to contest the d4 pawn and potentially create threats along the c-file if it ever opens, while also keeping an eye on the kingside. Exchanging bishops here fundamentally alters the positional landscape, sacrificing black's well-placed dark-squared bishop for white's arguably less influential one. This action immediately opens up the e-file for white's rook, a significant positional concession for black, and grants white greater freedom for its pieces on the queen side, particularly the knight that can now potentially hop to c4. The resulting pawn structure with double D, pawns for black, presents a long-term structural weakness that white can aim to exploit as the game progresses, especially if black isn't careful about defending them. Unlocking the d-file becomes a primary objective as the rook boldly occupies the open 7th rank, establishing a formidable presence and potentially eyeing breakthroughs on that crucial horizontal. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize central space, this daring advance ignites a battle for the kingside territory, simultaneously aiming to restrict black's active pieces and potentially open lines for white's assault should black's defenses falter. Unleashing the f-pawn aims to disrupt white's central control and create an immediate attacking opportunity, a sharp contrast to the previously static positioning. Exposing the kingside pawn chain with this exchange immediately offers tactical possibilities as the f6 square becomes a focal point for both armies. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal offers a much-needed antidote to white's growing space advantage on the kingside. This maneuver promises to reignite black's counterplay by preparing to challenge the central e-file and potentially exploit the slightly exposed white king. Rerouting the knight to the kingside initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to reinforce the beleaguered king and prepare for potential counterplay, even if it means relinquishing central influence for the moment. The black king, now feeling a bit cramped behind its own pawn shield, attempts to find a safer haven on g7, a typical maneuver to escape potential kingside pressure while also eyeing the central squares. A timely repositioning of the queen, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially support a central pawn push after regrouping. Finally, black breaks the stalemate in the center, injecting much-needed dynamism into the game and challenging white's pawn structure head-on. Opening the F file with this exchange immediately targets black's kingside pawn structure, potentially liberating white's pieces for more dynamic play, while simultaneously assessing the long-term impact on pawn weaknesses. Reclaiming the pawn on E5 immediately reestablishes black's central presence, creating a dynamic pawn structure and opening avenues for aggressive piece play. Shifting the queen to the king's flank opens up avenues for a potential kingside assault, eyeing the weakened pawn structure around black's king. Challenging the advanced pawn structure with an aggressive pawn sacrifice on F5 aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed central presence and unlock black's pieces. The queen's venture into the enemy camp, capturing the rook on C7, opens up a critical C-file for black's rook and significantly alters the piece dynamics, potentially leading to a more open and tactical middle game or even an early endgame if followed by exchanges. Securing the rook on the open file, black aims to pressure white's queenside pawns and disrupt their pawn structure while simultaneously offering a trade that simplifies into a potentially favorable endgame for black. The rook now vacates the 7th rank, aiming to exploit the open F-file and disrupt black's potentially developing queenside play. Recapturing with the bishop reestablishes piece harmony on the queenside, aiming to simplify into a more manageable middle game where black's remaining pawns can potentially become active. Reclaiming the initiative, this knight repositioning aims to exploit the compromised central pawns and potentially eye weaknesses around black's king, while also preparing for future piece exchanges that might favor white in a simplified position. Steering the rook to the 5th rank immediately disrupts white's central control and aims to exploit the open files, potentially creating attacking chances against the vulnerable white king by pressuring the d-pawn and restricting piece mobility. Establishing a safe haven for the king by widening the escape route is a prudent choice, preventing any sudden infiltration by the opposing bishop and knight which were eyeing that side of the board. Initiating a queenside pawn advance here aims to create breathing room for the king and potentially open a file for the rook should the opportunity arise, but it also risks weakening the kingside structure further. Asserting the open file becomes the immediate priority. Reorganizing the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the pawn on A5 and the queenside infrastructure. Reclaiming the b-file with the rook offers a more active presence, aiming to contest the open file and potentially create pressure on black's pawn structure, while simultaneously reinforcing the kingside after the recent exchange of pieces. Re-establishing a crucial defensive outpost, the bishop swings back to anchor the queenside pawns, anticipating potential infiltration along the semi-open c-file. Opening a new avenue with this pawn thrust, white seeks to dismantle black's queenside structure, potentially isolating that bishop and creating weaknesses on the c-file. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn grab immediately exposes the black king's shield to further intrusion, potentially creating weaknesses that white can exploit by maneuvering pieces like the rook on b4 towards the newly opened avenues. Seizing the isolated pawn opens up a critical central file, offering significant attacking potential that was previously blocked. Seizing the open file with the queen, black aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and create counterplay, though this might expose the king a bit as the rooks become disconnected. This aggressive rook sortie immediately disrupts black's pawn structure on the queenside, forcing a concession. Sacrificing the bishop to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for the remaining pieces marks a daring attempt to seize initiative in a rapidly simplifying position. The king's escape route is decisively shut off, creating a beautiful mating net. The king scurries from its immediate danger, a fleeting evasion, but the pawn majority on the queenside now threatens to become an unstoppable force. Exploiting the open diagonal created by your bishop's retreat, this knight's sacrifice rips open the kingside, aiming to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the monarch. Re-establishing the bishop on the queenside offers some defensive resilience, but it neglects the pressing need to mobilize black's remaining pieces. The A8 square feels like a temporary retreat rather than a strategic repositioning for future operations. Attempting to shore up the weakened queenside pawn structure with c3 significantly alters the strategic landscape, potentially creating a long-term structural vulnerability that could be exploited in the ensuing endgame. Asserting central influence, this pawn thrust challenges white's established presence and opens avenues for black's pieces. Opening the c-file now is essential, as your opponent has just solidified their pawn chain and aims to tie up your pieces. Embracing this file offers the best chance to activate your rook and potentially pressure black's isolated queen's pawn. Unleashing the king from its defensive shell into the fray, the black monarch bravely ventures forth, seeking counterplay amidst the open lines and potential mating nets that now define this chaotic endgame. The king's exposed position on the 6th rank after the capture of the bishop is now ruthlessly exploited by a fork, simultaneously threatening the black monarch and the advanced pawn on a5. Seeking sanctuary, the black king abandons the open central files, attempting to hide behind his remaining pawns and the queenside structure. Pouncing on the exposed bishop, this knight foray reclaims material while simultaneously launching a decisive assault on black's beleaguered king, initiating a swift endgame victory. The bishop retreats to a square where it can still exert influence on the queenside pawns and potentially assist in defending the king if needed, rather than being passively captured or forced into a worse position. Safeguarding the king is paramount, and shifting it to the g1 square solidifies its position and prepares for potential pawn advances on the king side, while also freeing up the h-file for other pieces. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance aims to disrupt white's queenside space advantage, forcing a reaction and potentially opening new avenues for black's pieces. Seeking to reclaim space and activate the bishop, this maneuver aims to reposition the minor piece to a more commanding diagonal, preparing for potential pawn advances or simply improving its defensive coverage of key squares. Reopening the diagonal for the bishop opens up a subtle pathway to attack the pawn on c3. Navigating the passed pawn's aggressive advance, white aims to neutralize black's queenside expansion by bringing the knight into a central outpost, ready to support the pawn's continued journey up the board. Navigating the king through such a complicated pawn structure creates a dangerous, exposed target, begging for tactical exploitation from the opponent's remaining pieces. The knight's sudden appearance on the 7th rank, snatching the pawn, injects a sharp tactical undertone into what seemed like a slowly developing positional struggle, creating an immediate threat to the black bishop and potentially opening avenues for further white incursions. Exploring the open diagonal, this placement anticipates a potential advance of the knight to a more active square or prepares to redeploy the bishop to support its own pawns. The knight's journey to b5 aims to disrupt black's island of pawns, specifically eyeing the d4 pawn and potentially creating further weaknesses with its presence. The bishop steps out, aiming to engage the opponent's weakened pawn structure on the queenside and potentially disrupt white's attempts to coordinate a final push. Clearing the b-file for the rook unleashes a potent tactical geometry, aiming to outmaneuver the isolated black pawn and exploit the king's exposed position. Unleashing a surprising check from the bishop, black aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially expose the king to further threats. Shifting the king offers a vital escape route from the immediate threat of the bishop and prepares to reposition it to a more active square, aiming to contest the open d-file and potentially support the central pawn push. The pawn on d3, recently gained, now becomes a target for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's nascent pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces in the chaotic endgame. Initiating a pawn race on the queenside to create a passed pawn. This move by white aims to leverage the passed pawn, forcing black to commit resources to its containment. The knight's repositioning to a3 is not just about supporting the pawn's advance, but also about preparing to swing over to the kingside, potentially creating threats against black's somewhat exposed king position, which has been a bit passive. While black has a strong central pawn majority, white is seeking to create a decisive advantage on the flank, aiming for a situation where black's defenders become overextended. It's a strategic decision, prioritizing breakthrough potential over immediate central action, a common theme when imbalances are present. The bishop embarks on a journey from its sheltered flank, aiming to contest the crucial diagonal opened by white's recent pawn advances. Bringing the bishop back to defend that crucial pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion offers a solid, if unglamorous, defense, aiming to neutralize black's active pieces and consolidate white's fragile advantages. Capturing the knight on c2 seems like a natural instinct, but this exchange of pieces doesn't improve black's position. Instead, it frees up white's pieces and potentially opens lines for counterplay, especially if white can quickly activate their remaining pieces. Consider the long-term implications of giving up a defender for a pawn, and whether this leads to a more favorable endgame for black. This knight's relocation to c2 solidifies the pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable bishop on c2, aiming to exploit black's slightly disconnected pieces. Embracing the open file, black forcefully injects the pawn, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure and create a passed majority in the center, a crucial objective in this endgame. Solidifying the knight's control over the central squares and preparing to support the d-pawn's advance creates a crucial outpost for white's pieces. Finally, the pawn thrusts forward, seeking to secure its promotion while simultaneously creating a dangerous passed pawn that will demand white's full attention, potentially forcing awkward piece exchanges or a desperate defense. The king's path to safety is now cruelly interrupted, forcing it into a potentially exposed position as the knight aggressively advances. The king ventures out from its protective fortress, seeking active participation in the final skirmish, a bold gambit to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and potentially create unexpected tactical opportunities. Seizing the open file now offers a clear path to unravel black's defense and dictate the game's final stages. The bishop's redeployment to the open d-file finally secures control of the critical central square, setting up a potential pawn push that could unravel white's queenside structure. The pawn push initiates a race, creating a decisive passed pawn that the king must now confront directly. The bishop retreats to a square where it offers solid defense to the central pawn structure, preparing to support the d-pawn's advance while maintaining an active diagonal. This pawn advance aggressively secures the queenside and aims to create a passed pawn on the c-file, a crucial objective in this endgame. The bishop repositions to a square where it can exert pressure along the a7-g1 diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially support a breakthrough for black's remaining forces. Opening up the queenside for your rook to infiltrate and disrupt the pawn structure is a sound idea, though be mindful of the potential weaknesses it creates on the d-file. The persistent pawn push onward creates an aggressive flank, seeking to disrupt white's defensive structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. A bold push to seize the open files, threatening to unravel black's precarious pawn structure. The pawn march g* is initiated, aiming to create space for the king on the kingside and potentially dislodge the strong white knight from its current outpost on the 7th rank. A timely repositioning to escape the pawn's attack and prepare for further king safety maneuvers. Embracing the final frontier, black's king boldly ventures into the heart of white's position, seeking to exploit the open files and potentially create a passed pawn through sheer audacity. This marks the critical juncture where the pawn, having traversed the board, finds its destiny at the 7th rank, forcing a decisive confrontation with the black bishop and potentially ushering in a swift conclusion. The bishop's sacrifice, while seemingly a last gasp to stop the pawn's advance, fundamentally concedes the crucial diagonal and the ability to contest the queenside, paving the way for white's king to emerge from its shell and join the inevitable pawn push with overwhelming support. The pawn's relentless march to promotion is about to become unstoppable, as it secures a vital foothold on the 6th rank, preventing any last-ditch defensive maneuvers from black's king. The bishop retreats, conceding the long diagonal and acknowledging the inevitability of the pawn's advance to the 7th rank. Reaching for that last square, the pawn's ascent transforms into an unstoppable force, a relentless march to queen, dictating the game's ultimate fate by forcing a decisive promotion. The bishop retreats to the edge, a passive stance that surrenders the initiative and allows white to solidify their pawn structure further with their own king now safely tucked away.